As the Battle of Okinawa raged in the spring of 1945, the skies above the Pacific became a brutal arena of destruction. The U.S. Navy's Third Fleet unleashed relentless air suppression raids, systematically dismantling Japan's last remaining naval air power. These strikes not only crippled enemy aircraft, but also ensured American dominance in the air. Paving the way for the final push towards Japan, Okinawa was more than just another battlefield in the Pacific. It was the final stepping stone to the Japanese mainland. Both sides understood its significance, and the island became the stage for one of the bloodiest confrontations of the war. The American High Command recognized early on that controlling the skies over Okinawa would be the key to securing victory. Without air superiority, the operation to take the island would be far more costly, with the threat of Japanese air raids and kamikaze attacks posing a constant danger to U.S. naval forces and ground troops. The Third Fleet, led by Admiral William Halsey, was tasked with a crucial mission, neutralizing Japan's remaining naval air power to ensure that American forces could advance without relentless aerial assaults. By 1945, Japan's once mighty air arm had suffered immense losses, but what remained was still dangerous. Airfields across Formosa, Kyushu, and Okinawa itself housed squadrons of fighters, bombers, and kamikaze units, all waiting for the right moment to strike. Intelligence reports indicated that Japan was preparing for a last-ditch aerial defense, with waves of suicide planes ready to launch against U.S. ships. The American command knew they couldn't afford to let that happen. The Third Fleet's air suppression campaign was designed to preemptively strike these air bases, ensuring that Japanese aircraft were destroyed before they could take to the skies. In the weeks leading up to the main invasion, American carrier groups moved into position, launching daily air raids on Japanese-held islands and coastal installations. Dive bombers and torpedo planes ripped through enemy airstrips, turning runways into craters and hangars into smoking wreckage. Fighter squadrons patrolled aggressively, engaging any Japanese planes that attempted to escape or intercept the bombers. The attacks were relentless, designed to break the back of Japan's air defenses before the amphibious assault on Okinawa began. Japanese resistance was fierce, but increasingly desperate. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from coastal batteries, while Japanese pilots scrambled to meet the oncoming waves of American aircraft. Dogfights erupted in the skies, but the superior training and firepower of U.S. aviators gave them the advantage. Japanese air units, already suffering from fuel shortages and a lack of experienced pilots, struggled to mount an effective defense. Each day that passed saw their numbers dwindle further, their ability to strike back diminishing with every American bombing run. Despite heavy losses, Japan continued to send kamikaze squadrons into battle, hoping to inflict enough damage on the American fleet to slow the invasion. These suicide pilots, willing to give their lives for their country, were among the most feared weapons in Japan's arsenal. But with air suppression raids systematically dismantling their staging grounds, the effectiveness of these attacks was greatly reduced. Many kamikaze planes were caught on the ground and destroyed before they could take off. Others were intercepted by American fighters long before they reached their targets. While some still managed to slip through the defenses, their numbers were far fewer than Japan had hoped. The scale of destruction inflicted by the Third Fleet was staggering. Japanese airfields were reduced to rubble, their aircraft either obliterated on the ground or shot down in the air. Pilots who survived the initial bombardments found themselves with nowhere to refuel or rearm. The once formidable naval air power of Japan, which had played such a critical role in earlier battles of the war, was now all but wiped out. For the American forces preparing to land on Okinawa, this was a decisive victory before the battle on the ground even began. The threat of large-scale Japanese air raids had been neutralized, allowing troop transports and warships to move in with greater confidence. While kamikaze attacks would continue throughout the battle, their impact was significantly weakened due to the relentless air suppression campaign. As the last remaining pockets of Japanese aerial resistance crumbled, the Third Fleet shifted its focus to supporting the ground invasion. Carrier-based aircraft provided close air support, striking enemy positions and softening defenses before Marines and Army units advanced. The skies belonged to the Americans, and with each passing day, Japan's ability to wage war from the air faded further into history. The air suppression raids over Okinawa were not just about destroying enemy aircraft. They were a strategic masterstroke that shaped the course of the battle. By eliminating Japan's ability to contest the skies, the U.S. secured a crucial advantage, one that would prove instrumental in the final months of the war. The destruction of Japan's naval airpower ensured that the road to victory in the Pacific was now clearer than ever. With Japanese air power severely weakened, the next phase of the campaign required an unrelenting offensive to completely cripple any remaining resistance. The Third Fleet's carrier groups operated with precision, launching waves of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes in a carefully coordinated assault. Every day, squadrons took off before sunrise, flying deep into enemy territory to strike airfields, supply depots, and coastal installations. The goal was not just to destroy infrastructure, but to ensure that Japan had no chance of mounting an effective counterattack. Aircraft carriers served as the backbone of these operations, acting as floating fortresses from which American pilots launched their missions. Flight decks were a flurry of activity, with crews working around the clock to arm and refuel planes before sending them back into battle. Aviators who had already completed one sortie often found themselves called upon for another within hours. Fatigue was a constant battle, but the men knew the importance of their mission. Every successful raid meant fewer Japanese planes in the sky and a safer path for the troops preparing to land on Okinawa. As American aircraft approached their targets, they often encountered sporadic resistance from anti-aircraft guns and the occasional enemy fighter. By this stage of the war, Japan's ability to field experienced pilots had been greatly diminished. Many of those who took to the air were young and barely trained, making them easy prey for battle-hardened U.S. aviators. Dogfights erupted over key airfields, but the outcome was rarely in doubt. American fighters, equipped with superior firepower and radar-guided coordination, methodically eliminated their opponents before allowing bombers to move in and finish the job. The devastation on the ground was immense. Airstrips were left in ruins, hangars engulfed in flames, and fuel depots reduced to smoldering craters. Some Japanese pilots, realizing their situation was hopeless, attempted to launch suicide attacks directly from the ground. In desperate last-ditch efforts, they took off under heavy bombardment, trying to ram American planes or ships before being cut down by enemy fire. But these acts of defiance did little to change the inevitable. The sheer scale of destruction ensured that Japan's ability to contest the skies was slipping away with each passing hour. As the raids continued, American pilots became more familiar with the terrain and enemy positions, allowing them to refine their tactics. Bombing runs became increasingly precise, targeting critical infrastructure with ruthless efficiency. High-altitude bombers unleashed payloads on fortified positions, while low-flying attack aircraft strafed enemy convoys attempting to move supplies to what little remained of Japan's defensive positions. Coordination between different squadrons ensured that no target was left untouched, and by the time the last wave of aircraft returned to their carriers, the landscape below had been transformed into a wasteland of wreckage. Japanese commanders scrambled to salvage what little they could. Some attempted to relocate remaining aircraft to makeshift runways hidden in forests or camouflaged beneath netting. Others ordered surviving pilots to relocate to Kyushu in a last effort to regroup for a future counteroffensive. But these measures were ultimately futile. American reconnaissance aircraft patrolled constantly, spotting and eliminating any signs of renewed activity. Carrier groups maintained relentless pressure, ensuring that every attempt to rebuild was met with immediate destruction. Meanwhile, the toll on Japan's aircrew was devastating. With each passing day, fewer trained pilots remained to fly the dwindling number of operational aircraft. Many of the men now taking to the skies had barely completed their training, some with only a few hours of flight time before being sent into combat. The result was predictable. In nearly every engagement, American pilots outmaneuvered and outgunned their opponents, shooting them down before they could pose a serious threat. The once proud squadrons of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had terrorized the Pacific in the early years of the war, were now a shadow of their former selves. As losses mounted, Japan resorted to increasingly desperate measures. Some commanders ordered aircraft to be hidden in caves and tunnels, waiting for an opportunity to launch a surprise attack. But these tactics had little effect. American ground forces advancing on Okinawa received intelligence on these locations and targeted them with heavy bombardment. In many cases, entire squadrons were buried under collapsing rock before they could even attempt to take off. Despite the overwhelming odds, the remnants of Japan's air forces continued to fight with determination. Individual pilots, aware that they were unlikely to return, launched one final assault after another, hoping to inflict even the smallest amount of damage. Some kamikaze units still managed to break through the American defensive screen, striking ships and causing casualties. But these attacks were nowhere near the scale that Japan had initially planned. The overwhelming success of the air suppression campaign had ensured that most enemy aircraft never even made it off the ground. As the final weeks of the operation played out, it became clear that Japan's naval airpower had been effectively destroyed. The skies above Okinawa belonged to the Americans, allowing the invasion to proceed with far fewer losses than expected. What had once been a formidable aerial force was now reduced to scattered remnants, incapable of influencing the outcome of the battle. The Third Fleet's relentless assault had achieved its goal, securing air superiority and paving the way for the final push toward Japan. With the last remnants of Japanese air power crumbling under the relentless pressure of American raids, the skies over Okinawa became a domain of near-total U.S. control. The once proud Naval Air Force that had challenged the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the Philippine Sea was now reduced to scattered wreckage and desperate, isolated pilots with no bases left to return to. The destruction was not just physical, it was psychological. The realization that their air force had been rendered almost useless weighed heavily on Japanese commanders, who now faced the grim reality that they could no longer defend their homeland from the inevitable. As American forces solidified their grip on the skies, the battle for Okinawa on the ground intensified. Troops advancing along the beaches and through fortified positions knew that the air superiority they now enjoyed came at a high cost. Pilots who had flown countless missions returned to their carriers battered by exhaustion, their planes riddled with bullet holes from the final struggles of a desperate enemy. But their mission was clear: ensure that no enemy aircraft could threaten the fleet, the landing forces, or the steady buildup of American strength in the region. While the primary objective had been achieved, the air raids did not stop. Carrier squadrons now shifted their focus to hunting down the last pockets of resistance, striking any location where enemy aircraft might still be hidden. Caves, makeshift runways, and forest clearings that could serve as launch points were targeted with relentless bombing runs. Some Japanese aircraft, unable to flee, remained hidden, their pilots waiting for an opportunity to strike when the Americans least expected it. But with constant patrols and reconnaissance flights, even these desperate attempts were doomed. Kamikaze attacks, once feared for their devastating impact, became increasingly rare. Without proper airfields to launch from, and with American fighters dominating the air, fewer suicide planes managed to reach their targets. Those that did were often shot down long before they could inflict serious damage. The battleships and carriers of the U.S. fleet remained on constant alert, their gunners scanning the skies for any sign of an incoming strike. The once overwhelming waves of kamikaze pilots Japan had counted on to turn the tide were now reduced to sporadic, uncoordinated attacks, easily intercepted and destroyed. On the ground, Japanese soldiers who had once relied on air support to help defend their positions now found themselves abandoned. Artillery crews had no spotting aircraft to direct their fire. Supply convoys could no longer count on air cover to shield them from American bombers, and defensive positions once bolstered by strafing runs from friendly planes were now left exposed. The loss of air superiority turned every engagement into an uphill battle for Japanese troops, making it impossible to mount the kind of counteroffensive they had hoped for. American pilots, despite their overwhelming success, knew that their work was far from over. Even with most Japanese aircraft eliminated, the fight for complete control of the skies demanded constant vigilance. Carrier decks remained busy, launching combat air patrols, reconnaissance missions, and ground support strikes as the invasion continued. Every sortie brought new challenges: weather conditions, anti-aircraft fire from the few remaining enemy positions, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure or damage from previous engagements. Yet the confidence that came with knowing they had gained the upper hand fueled their determination. For Japanese leadership, the devastation of their naval airpower signaled a bitter truth. With no effective aerial defense remaining, the homeland itself was now vulnerable to attacks unlike any seen before. The inability to challenge American bombers meant that major cities, industrial centers, and military installations would soon feel the full weight of an unopposed air assault. The fall of Okinawa would only accelerate what was now inevitable: the final confrontation that would decide the fate of the war. As the days passed and the last remaining enemy aircraft were hunted down, the realization of what had been accomplished settled in. The Third Fleet's relentless campaign had not just crippled Japanese airpower. It had erased it as a factor in the war. The skies over Okinawa belonged entirely to the United States, ensuring that the invasion could proceed with a level of security that had been impossible in earlier battles. From this moment forward, Japan's war effort would be fought without one of its most crucial elements, leaving only the ground forces and the remnants of the Navy to stand against an unstoppable force. For the men who had flown the countless missions, the victories were hard-earned. They had faced determined opposition, braved intense anti-aircraft fire, and engaged in aerial combat that tested every ounce of their skill. Yet in the end, they had emerged victorious. The suppression raids had not just won a battle. They had shifted the course of the entire war, ensuring that Japan's ability to resist was now weaker than ever. The road to final victory was now open, and there was nothing left in the skies to stand in the way. With the skies over Okinawa firmly in American hands, the impact of the air suppression raids became undeniable. The once formidable Japanese Air Force, which had launched daring attacks across the Pacific, was now a shattered remnant of its former self. For the U.S. forces pressing forward in the brutal ground battle, the absence of enemy aircraft meant they could operate without the constant fear of sudden aerial assaults. The destruction of Japan's naval airpower had reshaped the battlefield, tilting the odds irreversibly in favor of the advancing Americans. Without air support, Japanese defenders were left to fight in isolation. Supplies that might have been airdropped to beleaguered units never arrived, and reinforcements that could have been transported by air were no longer an option. The lack of reconnaissance aircraft meant their commanders had little understanding of enemy movements, leaving them to fight blindly against an overwhelming force. Meanwhile, American ground troops moved with greater confidence, knowing that their air cover was absolute. Bombers and fighter planes now turned their attention to supporting the invasion, striking fortified positions and clearing the way for advancing Marines and soldiers. The psychological toll on the Japanese forces was immense. They had been trained to expect air cover, to rely on their pilots to weaken enemy advances and disrupt supply lines. Now, those expectations had crumbled. Morale among the defenders sank as they realized there would be no relief from the constant bombardment. Their remaining anti-aircraft guns, once a formidable deterrent, were now used only in desperation, firing sporadically at American planes that faced little real threat. Without resupply, ammunition dwindled, leaving many weapons silent when they were needed most. As the final pockets of resistance were crushed, the broader consequences of the campaign became clear. The destruction of Japan's airpower not only ensured victory at Okinawa, but also paved the way for the next phase of the war. With no effective aerial defense left, the American military could strike deeper into Japanese territory without fear of significant opposition. Bombers could now reach the heart of the empire, targeting industrial centers and military installations with devastating precision. The homeland, once protected by layers of defensive aircraft, was now vulnerable to the full force of American air superiority. In the weeks following the battle, reconnaissance flights confirmed what American commanders had suspected. There was little left of Japan's ability to fight in the air. The remaining aircraft were scattered, many hidden in caves or buried under debris in a futile attempt to preserve them. Some had been abandoned entirely, left to rust on ruined airfields. The destruction of Japan's naval aviation had not just affected Okinawa, but had crippled the nation's entire strategic defense. For the men who had carried out the air suppression raids, There was little time to reflect on their success. The war was not over, and new missions awaited. Carrier decks remained active as squadrons prepared for the next phase of operations, knowing that their efforts had helped bring the conflict closer to its final resolution. They had eliminated a major threat, ensuring that American forces could move forward with an overwhelming advantage. Back in Japan, the loss of air power forced military leaders to confront a grim reality. Without the ability to challenge American bombers, the homeland was now open to attacks on an unprecedented scale. Factories that once produced weapons of war could no longer be protected. Supply lines that had once been defended by fighter squadrons now lay exposed. The Empire's ability to resist was slipping away, and there was nothing left in the skies to stop what was coming. As the war entered its final stages, the destruction of Japanese air power remained one of the defining moments of the Pacific Campaign. It had not only secured victory at Okinawa, but had also sealed Japan's fate. The skies belonged to the Americans, and with each passing day, the path to the war's end became clearer. The air suppression raids had done more than eliminate enemy aircraft. They had ensured that Japan could no longer defend itself from the inevitable. The battle for Okinawa had been won, and now, the final chapters of the war were about to be written. With Japan's skies stripped of their defenders, the full weight of American air power was now free to press forward without resistance. What had once been a war fought across the vast Pacific was now closing in on the Japanese homeland itself. The loss of naval aviation had sealed Japan's fate, leaving the nation's military to rely solely on its dwindling ground forces and the last remnants of its navy, neither of which could withstand the overwhelming strength of the advancing Allied forces. From the decks of the U.S. carriers, pilots who had flown countless missions over Okinawa prepared for their next objectives. The sense of finality was beginning to settle in, not just among the American forces, but within the highest ranks of Japan's leadership. With no aircraft to challenge incoming bombers, the full force of strategic air raids would soon be unleashed on cities and industrial centers, bringing devastation on a scale that had once been unimaginable. Despite the hopeless situation, Japan's military refused to surrender. They clung to the belief that the homeland could still be defended through sheer will and sacrifice. But without air support, the reality of their position was undeniable. Supplies ran low, weapons fell silent, and soldiers who had once been bolstered by the roar of their own aircraft overhead now fought alone, abandoned by the very force that had once been their shield. American bombers took advantage of this vulnerability, launching deep into enemy territory with near impunity. Firestorms engulfed entire cities, industrial production ground to a halt, and military installations were left in ruins. Every raid brought the war closer to its inevitable end, as Japan's ability to fight back diminished with each passing day. The destruction that had begun with the air suppression raids over Okinawa had now escalated to a full-scale assault on the heart of the empire. For the Japanese people, the loss of air superiority meant living under the constant threat of destruction. The skies, once patrolled by their own pilots, now belonged to an enemy that showed no signs of relenting. Fear gripped the nation as wave after wave of American aircraft passed overhead, delivering blows that Japan had no means of stopping. Even the most hardened military leaders could no longer deny the truth. Without control of the air, the war was unwinnable. On the carriers, the men who had played a part in this turning point understood the significance of what had been accomplished. They had fought through relentless missions, faced fierce resistance, and watched their comrades fall in battle. Yet their efforts had paved the way for an end to the war, ensuring that the sacrifices made throughout the Pacific Campaign had not been in vain. They had broken the enemy's air force, destroyed its ability to resist, and cleared the skies for the final stage of the conflict. As the war neared its conclusion, the impact of the air suppression campaign became evident. What had started as a tactical effort to weaken Japanese resistance had turned into one of the most decisive blows of the entire conflict. The once mighty Naval Air Force, which had been a symbol of Japanese power, had been reduced to scattered wreckage. The nation's defenders had been stripped of their ability to strike back. The road to victory was now open, and nothing remained to stop the inevitable. In the final moments of the war, as Japan stood on the brink of surrender, The echoes of the air suppression raids still lingered. They had not only secured victory at Okinawa, but had also marked the beginning of the end for an empire that had once dominated the skies. The destruction of Japan's air power had sealed its fate, ensuring that the war's final act would play out on terms dictated entirely by the Allies. When the surrender was finally declared, the pilots and crew who had fought in those crucial battles knew that their mission had been accomplished. They had cleared the way for victory, reshaped the course of the war, and ensured that the sacrifices of those who had fought before them had not been in vain. As they looked back on the campaign, they understood that the skies had been the battleground where the war's outcome had been decided. And in those skies, they had emerged victorious,